Hi, everyone. When I first became a rabbi, I had to register as a clergyman allowed to perform marriages in New York City. Back then, the Office of Clergy Registration was one of the most polite governmental offices that the city had. The people were so incredibly polite, and the process was supposed to be quite streamlined. On the day that I went down to register, I found myself stuck behind two people: a minister who worked at the Department of Corrections, who was an online reverend hoping to officiate at his sister in law's wedding that weekend, and a woman whose attire was so bright that it hurt my eyes. I found out that she was the priestess of the sun god, and that she too wanted to bring people to holy matrimony. The priestess's religion was a new one to the office, and so there was a need for me to calmly wait my turn. Luckily, I was given a chance to view a wedding taking place right next door with the justice of the peace. The justice administered the vows to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, etc., like you saw on TV. It was lovely, and it was quick because the couple had to rush to finish in time before the end of lunch to get back to work. I remember thinking that the vows were merely a commitment issue about having and holding, loving and cherishing. They didn't mean or mention sharing, respecting, or defending. I didn't know why. I was reminded of that episode this week when my wife and I were discussing the recent article that a cherished friend had written about marriage and whether spouses are responsible for that which their spouses say and do. While finding ourselves agreeing with the difficulty that silence in the face of a spouse who publicly advocates support for terrorism or public desecration, are families really supposed to suffer and share the responsibility of the spouse who sins always? What happens to a spouse who strongly differs with the sinning spouse, but lacks the capacity to stop his or her sinning ways? And what about the couple where one of the spouses has fallen off the wagon of observance? Now, assuming that the other spouse must constantly chastise the first one and humiliate him or her in public or in front of the children doesn't seem feasible, and perhaps doesn't even seem like a good idea. So, in these cases, isn't assigning collective responsibility further victimizing the person? And while it's true that there are women in Jewish tradition who were able to stop their husbands from public sin, the wife of On ben Peles of the famous Korach episode comes to mind, there are others who lack the same power to stop sin. Do we hold them accountable in the same way as their spouses? And by the way, even Mrs. Ben Peles didn't speak out against her husband. She took matters into her own hands. Yes, the Talmud tells us that she left him in the tent and stood in the doorway dressed in a manner that others wouldn't come and try to come past her to get to her husband. But to publicly respond? She did not. Was she also incorrect? Rav Shlomo Luria, famed Maharshal, refused to remove the wife of a man who was put into cherem, into excommunication from shul. And despite the petitioner noting that his request was consistent with the position of Paltai Gon, the spouse of one in cherem must not be allowed to attend services in shul. The Maharshal refused, noting that while the husband may have sinned, the wife did not. He noted that he thought that the quote from the Gaon must be a misquote. And again, Maharshal highlights the idea that while spouses may have and hold, they don't always agree and need not be thought of collectively for punishment as a result. But is this spouse responsible to at least try? Perhaps we might come to an understanding if we asked our question from the opposite perspective. What if one spouse does a mitzvah? Does it reflect on the other spouse positively automatically? Is there a collective reward? Or must both spouses actively be a part of the mitzvah and demonstrate agreement in order to be rewarded? On the one hand, again, if there is to be collective punishment, then I guess there should be collective reward as well. Indeed, Rabbi Akiva attributed his Torah accomplishments and those of his students to his wife, as he famously declared, Shali v'shalachem, my reward and yours, Shalahi, it's really hers, his wife's. Now recall, his wife had not met these students insofar as she hadn't seen her husband for 24 years. And yet, Rabbi Akiva saw the reward as a shared one between them. At the same time, the Talmud seemed to suggest that women are rewarded when they encourage their spouses to reach higher heights in Torah achievements, implying that they need to actively be supportive. So are spouses responsible for the sins of their significant others if they don't speak out against them? Do they have the rights to share in their spouse's earned reward, even if they don't actively agree? Perhaps a pasuk in this week's parsha might actually shed some light on our issue. The parsha details the carrying out of the plans for the fundraising and ultimately the building of the Mishkan and its components, completing the plans that were laid out in Parshas Truma and Tetzaveh and bringing them to fruition. And in regard to the fundraising, we're told, Vayavo ho'anoshim al hanoshim, that the men came on top of the women. Now the Medrash notes that the women came first, rushing to donate their jewelry for the Mishkan. And this was a sharp contrast to the Egel, where they did not want their jewelry taken. Ramban adds that they came first since they were the ones who had gold to give. In fact, the Medrash noted that they came so fast that by the time their husbands came to donate, it was like a mob-like situation, and the men almost tripped over the women. Hence the wording in the pasuk, al hanoshim. But many of the Mefarshim, many of the commentaries note that the couples actually came together. They note that the jewelry was jointly owned, and that it should be unfathomable that either spouse, with respect and care for the other spouse, would dare make a donation without checking with the other. For the Jewish nature of Kedusha and a marriage begins when the couple works together and genuinely tries to respect one another. And hence, a few short psukim later, we read, Kol ish v'isha asher nadav libam osam lahavi l'chol amlacha. That when each man and each woman whose heart inspired them made a donation. That's right. The donation was brought by a couple, ish v'isha, but as a single unit, nadav libam. They worked on things, and they did so together. Does that mean that our couples are not allowed to disagree? Certainly not. But Jewish couples, even those that disagree, need to be there for one another as one goes through tough times and failings, even those that are spiritual in the process. At our Jewish weddings in Sheva Brachos, we call the Chassan and Kala Re'im Ahuvim, beloved friends. The famous Rebbe Reb Simcha Bunim of Peshischa would note that the term Re'ah, or this type of friend, comes from the word Ra, because real beloved friends, partners for life, they need to be there to care for one another when one of them falters. There can be a differing of opinion, but there needs to be care if there's ever going to be any attempt for repair. But there can't be room for public disgrace of Hashem's name. For when the public disgrace of Hashem is apparent, then the home and the bond is wrecked. Chazal tell us that the Shekhinah supports the marriage if the couple is worthy. But if they're not, then that bond will be consumed by fire. The fire, I believe, is the one of Chilul Hashem. At that time, it is incumbent upon the spouse to speak up. So if a spouse promotes an untenable position as that of his or her own, even as speaking as a private individual, then all people, including his or her spouse, should state that it's wrong. When there's a question of Chilul Hashem, then the issue of individual respect needs to be put on that side. And if we don't do so, we're responsible not only for our spouses, but for humanity, and the fact that we allow humanity to publicly act or speak in an ungodly way. At the same time, when our spouses create a Kiddush Hashem, we continue to take pride in those actions and support and laud them, just as we would any Kiddush Hashem that publicly raises worldly awareness of Hashem's dominion here. When the Jews built the Mishkan, husbands and wives came together to contribute. The Torah could have described individual donors, but instead it describes ish v'isha, because holiness is so often built through partnership. The Torah doesn't describe husbands and wives competing in righteousness or policing one another's failures. Instead, it describes them standing together, ish v'isha asher nadav libam, two people whose two hearts move together towards holiness, even if they arrive at different moments. And in that regard, Judaism doesn't demand that a spouse bear punishment for the sins of the other. No, a marriage isn't a courthouse. or even a news conference on the courthouse steps. It's a place where people help each other grow, where they support one another even when faith is weak, and celebrate when faith is strong. But there's one boundary we cannot cross. When the honor of Hashem is publicly desecrated, when there's chilul Hashem, then silence is no longer loyalty. Then love itself demands that we speak, because the holiest homes are not those without struggle, friends, but those where loyalty to each other and loyalty to Hashem ultimately stand together. Yes, Jewish marriage is not built on perfect agreement, but it's built on shared devotion to something higher than either spouse alone. That's what maintains the Jewish home. Wishing you and yours, especially your spouses, a Shabbat Shalom and a Shabbat Shalom to all.